Hello and good evening to one and all. Welcome back to our lecture series on history of English literature. And I'm very pleased to tell you that we have started with the Romantic period very particularly. Prior to that, we have discussed about Age of Sensibility and also Augustan era. Also, we have talked about the major themes and prominent works that got greatly explored in this. We have tried to explore the works of those figures. So let us continue with what we have been discussing so far about, right? And in this lecture series, now in today's lecture series, we are going to discuss in detail about the prominent figures and all sort of writers, poets, novelists who were there in the Romantic period, whose ideas in a way have shaped the framework of Romantic period. How Romantic period remains one of the significant factor of this age, very particularly keeping our net and set examination into our vision, right? And let us commence with that. Otherwise, so we are talking about history of English literature so far, and now we are supposed to, in a way, begin with an interesting part of our today's discussion. Exactly, right? And we are going to begin with. We have already started talking about Romantic period, and if you remember, in yesterday's lecture, we have talked about, we also had, the brief historical. We also have discussed the brief historical background of this period, what were the things and all other things. Apart from that, in our previous lecture, already we have talked about this age of sensibility. Exactly. If you remember, in our previous lecture, we have talked about. In the last week's lecture, we have talked about age of sensibility, which remains again one of the prominent periods in history of English literature, which has joined the gap between neoclassical period and also has laid a foundation or has prepared a soil for Romantic period. The Romantic period started officially with the publication of lyrical ballads in association by Wordsworth in association with S.T. Coleridge, and after that we have seen many prominent figures have greatly contributed in Romantic period, their ideas, their thoughts, exactly. But in a way, we also have got to know about, so we have discussed in a way in a study lecture. We have tried to cover up the brief historical background in a way. Then we have been through the characteristics, particularly characteristics of this period, right? Then, right, or we can say some prominent features, or then we talked about the themes that got discussed in this period, which were the themes, exactly, themes like nature, exactly, individualism, or where we can see more of value to emotions, or let's say feelings, exactly. Then nature, individualism, emotional feelings. That is more about imagination as a truth, right? Imagination as a truth. We also talked about this imagination as a truth, and also the language, exactly. Let's say language. That's what Wordsworth then talked. Language of a man, or language of men. So these are the several features of this very period. When we talk about this, that historical background, then the characteristics that are important, exactly. Then the themes, right? So we also had a brief history of all those periods, all those elements that belong to the historical, the Romantic period, very particularly. Now, apart after discussing about those many periods, let us go and talk about the prominent figures. that existed. So if you remember, we also had in a way the brief background of the works by the prominent figures. We talked about S.T. Coleridge, we talked about William Wordsworth. I think we also have talked about P.B. Shelley. So these are the prominent figures about whom we have already talked in detail. But it is not just only about talking about those very prominent figures in detail, but also there are several other authors. And then there are works in romantic period especially which are in a way created in collaboration, especially collaboration between Wordsworth and Coleridge, collaboration between Wordsworth and Southey, exactly, and Wordsworth becoming a poet laureate of England after the death of William no, Robert Southey. So these are the various incidents that remain very much significant. Also, now keeping the NATE and examination, we are also going to discuss about the various works, the themes that existed in the works, and ideologies that got discussed in various writings by those prominent figures in romantic period particularly, right? So let's not waste the time and move to discuss the period in an interesting way otherwise. So Age of Romanticism, which prominently covers from 1798 to 1850, exactly. So this age, now what are the characteristics of age? This age, the name Romanticism is dominant movement in literature and other arts, especially music and painting in the period of 1798 to 1850. It continued in further part also, but the major time span it has covered is 1798 to 1850. Exactly. Now, looking at the main feature of this age, in a way, the main feature of this age is importance to self-expression and individual feeling. It emphasizes. So, in a way, when we try to understand what is the significant factor of this age, it is that the importance given to self-expression and individual feeling. Also, it emphasized on the truth of imagination, right, and rather than the scientific truth. When we look at the neoclassical period or the entire happenings, industrial civilization, scientific advancement, exactly, so many things were taking place at a time, advancement in technology. So all those factors otherwise have in a way levelized this very interesting way, saying that in a way saying that it is the must or it is the most important factor that has to be discussed so far. So when we look at this very period, that the prominent feature is that giving much of importance to individual expressions and believing in imagination as a truth rather than the scientific truth, right? So looking at the two prominent figures, Shelley, he was like an atheist, but Wordsworth was something like a pantheist. Pantheist means somebody who believed in God is everything. Now looking at this, one of the attribute of this age is that Thomas Chatterton, about whom we have discussed in Age of Sensibility, beginning with romantic platform, he is considered as the first romantic poet in English. So we have to mark that Thomas Chatterton is the one who is remarked as the first poet, first romantic poet in English. The German critic, Friedrich Schlegel, had said to have been the first to use the term Romanticism for describing the school of poets and writers opposed the classics. Exactly. To labelize them Romanticism. So who was the one? Exactly. It was the German critic, Friedrich Schlegel, who have said for the first to use the term Romanticism. Exactly, and that to describe the school of poets. तो असे कुछ पोएट्स थे, अशा काही कवींचा समूह होता की ज्यांनी क्लासिकल आयडियाजला अपोज केलं. आणि जेव्हा त्यांनी या क्लासिकल आयडियाजला अपोज केलं, तेव्हा अशा ग्रुपला फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम who labelized them as a romantics, it was the German critic. No, and Wordsworth, being the prominent figure of this period, is known as the nature poet. And then we have got a list of further poets who play a kind of a contributory role in a significant way. It is Coleridge, who is called as the supernatural poet. Then we have got Byron, who is called a poet of humanism. Then you have got a Shelley, is poet of love. Keats is called as a poet of beauty, and Walter Scott is a poet of medieval love. Poet of medieval love. So these are the prominent, names which we have to keep in mind. One of the prominent incident of this, that War of Peterloo. War of Peterloo occurred in 1819, and that was in the Romantic period. Then we have got F.R. Lucas, who gave 11,336 96 definitions of Romanticism in his book The Decline and Fall of Romantic Ideal. It was F.L. Lucas. F.L. Lucas, who gave 11,396 definition of Romanticism in his work The Decline and Fall of Romantic Ideal. Victor Hugo is called the Romanticism. Victor Hugo has called Romanticism as a liberalism in literature, right? Victor Hugo is one of the French poets, and called as also the pioneer of Romantic period. Has labelized Romanticism as a liberalism of literature. Then we have got Goethe, who said that Romanticism is a disease, classicism is health. So such are the comments about this very interesting period, that is Romanticism. Moving ahead, let us begin with now the prominent figures who are called as the forefathers, or let us call as a father of Romanticism, S.T. Coleridge and William Wordsworth. Talking about William Wordsworth, he is a major English Romantic poet along with S.T. Coleridge, helped to launch the Romantic age in English literature with their joint publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798. And since there, the official commencement of Romanticism or Romantic period is considered. Wordsworth's magnum opus, in considered, to be the prelude, a semi-autobiographical poem of his early years, and it was posthumously titled and published, but before it was called the poem to Coleridge. He was the second among the five children. Talking about his personal life, he was the second among the five children born to John Wordsworth and Anne Cookson on 7th April 1770 in Lake District. His sister Dorothy Wordsworth was also a poet and a diarist. She would write her, regular incidents in diaries, sometimes creative and sometimes very imaginative. Wordsworth's father was a legal representative to James Lowther, first Earl of Launcelot. Wordsworth made his debut. Now, this is quite important, keeping the exam in mind, when he made his debut as a writer in 1787 at the age of 17. He published a sonnet, in the European magazine when he began attending St. John's College, Cambridge, for his graduation. In 1791, exactly, he visited revolutionary France, and there he fell in love with Annette Vallon, who gave birth to his daughter Caroline. Exactly. So he fell in love with Annette Vallon, who gave birth to his daughter Caroline. He could not marry her as she returned to England in lack of money. Later, he married Mary Hutchinson. He wrote a sonnet. William Wordsworth wrote a sonnet. It's a beauty's evening, calm and free, recalling a seaside walk with 9-year-old Caroline, his daughter. Right. So the year 1793 saw the publication of poems by him in the collection An Evening Walk and Descriptive Sketches. In 1795, he met Coleridge. William Wordsworth met Coleridge, and so in 1998, in 1798, we find them their publication of Lyrical Ballads in association. So in 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge together published Lyrical Ballads. None of the writers had the name of the first publication of Lyrical Ballads. So in the first edition, in 1798, where the Wordsworth, Tintern Abbey, and Coleridge Rime of Ancient Mariner, it starts with Mariner and ends with Tintern Abbey. No, the Lyrical Ballads particularly. Now, looking at the second edition, it was published in 18 double naught, that is 1800, and it listed Wordsworth as an author and included a preface to the poem. The preface to Lyrical Ballad is actually republished in 1888, is quite important. So he has used the real language of man rather than 18th century words in his preface. So he claimed that using the real language of man rather than the 18th century words. So between 1795 to 1795 to 1797, his only play, The Borders, a verse tragedy set during the reign of Henry III of England. He wrote a number of famous poems. William Wordsworth has written so many poems, and famous of them include the Lucy poems. It is a collection of 5 poems, which are, now if it is asked in exam, which poems are included, or these 5 poems are included in which of Wordsworth's collection, the collection is called as the Lucy poems. So the poems are Strange Fits of Passion, have I known, then She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways, I Travel Among Unknown Men, 3 Years She Grew in Sun and Shower, A Slumber did my spirit sail. He wrote the prelude when he was in Germany with Coleridge and Dorothy, his sister, and finally he, along with Southey, Robert Southey and Coleridge, settled in Lake District and thus called Lake Poets. So, to who called him Lake Poets is a question for us, and we'll be definitely going to find out who has called him Lake Poets. But when he, along with Coleridge, got settled in Lake District, the trio were called Lake Poets collectively, right? So he planned to write larger philosophical poem called the Recluse. So he wrote poem to Coleridge to make an appendix to Recluse. That was a poem. That is poem to Coleridge, which was earlier considered as a recluse. So it is not recluse actually. It is an appendix to recluse, right? His poem to Coleridge is referred as the first version of the prelude, completed in 1805. He has also written a shorter work, a line written above Tintin Abbey. In 1807, he published poems in two volumes, including Ode, Imitation of Immortality, from recollections of early childhood. Right, and in 1814, we find him publishing The Excursion as the second of three-part work of the Recluse and the no, and even though he had not completed first and third part ever in his life, so he just published the second part actually of the three. So he had to write first and third part yet, and then he could not ever write in his life anymore. So in London, 1802, he addressed to Milton. In 1838, he received an honorary doctorate in civil law, and in 1842 he was awarded a civil list pension of 300 euros per year. Now, after the death of Southey, Robert Southey, in 1843, it was the time 1843. It was in the year 1843. William Wordsworth became a poet laureate, and he became the only poet laureate to write no official verses. Now, after death, he was buried at St. Oswald Church, uh, Grasmere. His wife Mary Hutchinson published his lengthy autobiographical poem, The Prelude, after his death in 1850. William Wordsworth got died, and then after him, it was his wife who published his remaining work. Now, the Prelude is also called as Growth of Poet's Mind. Grasmere Journal is written by Dorothy Wordsworth. Now, Browning and Hazlitt called Wordsworth a lost leader. It is quite important for exam, according to exam point of view, to have an idea of those labels that are assigned to him. Yes, and he was called lost labor by Robert Browning and Hazlitt. He is also called a giant of English poetry by J.C. Ransom. uh, and it is noted that around 523 sonnets are written by William Wordsworth. In an 1817 review of Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, Francis Jeffrey coined the term Lake School of Poets, Lake School of Poets, including Wordsworth. Yeah? So it was Francis Jeffrey, yes, who called Robert Southey, William Wordsworth, and S.T. Coleridge as a Lake Poets and Lake School of Poets, indicating Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey as a Lake Poets. Moving ahead, we have to focus on the major works, but prior to that, it was in 1802 he praised Milton's sonnet for the energetic and varied flow of sound crowding into narrow room, more of the combined effect of rhyme and blank verse that can be done by any other kind of verse that I know of. Such a kind of a praise he made of a work by John Milton, in 1802. Now, what are his major works that include? The one is Lyrical Ballads, which got published in 1798. Then Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tinton Abbey. Then Lyrical Ballads, along with Preface to Lyrical Ballads in 18, not the second edition of Lyrical Ballads. Then Lucy Gray, the Lucy Poems or Solitude. It is a collection of 5 poems, as we said, the Lucy Poems, a collection of 5 poems. Then poems in 2 volumes. Then The World Is Too Much With Us is a sonnet by Wordsworth. Here in this, He criticizes the world of the first industrial revolution for being absorbed in materialism and distancing itself from nature. Right. So, as it was aligning with the theme of romanticism. This poem, "The World Is Too Much with Us," remains kind of like an it is like an example which is to be referred to understand the thematic approach of romantic poets towards the contemporary era. The poem was first published in Poems in two volumes, that is 1800. Like most Italian sonnet, it is 14 lines are written in iambic pentameter. I wandered lonely as a cloud, also called Daffodils, is again one of the famous poems and greatly studied by many scholars and actually taught in across the world in many schools very particularly. Ode, Intimation of Immortality, is also again is a famous work. The Solitary Reaper, again a very famous poem in two volumes. The World is Too Much with Us, a famous sonnet, right? Then the Kaku, then Excursion, the Prelude, the Borders, no, a verse tragedy that he had written. Then Michael, a pastoral poem, part of a lyrical ballads in 18 knot collections, right? That descriptive sketches, My Heart Leaps Up When I Behold. Then Repentance, Ode to Duty, To a Skylark, The Recluse, then Luramia, then Peter Bell, then Guide to the Lakes, then Elegiac Stanzas, then Resolution and Independence, the Leech Gatherer, Resolution and Independence, Nuts Fret Not at Their Converts Narrow Room. Exactly, a Patri sonnet in 1818. It's kind of a Petrarchan sonnet. Exactly, and rhyme scheme which has a B B A B B A C D C D, also called a sonnet upon sonnet, and the tablestone. Now, what are the various criticisms that are on William Wordsworth so far? Matthew Arnold referred Wordsworth in his own quotes. He is not fully recognized at home. He is not recognized at all abroad. Yet I firmly believe that the poetical poem of Wordsworth is, after that of Shakespeare and Milton, undoubtedly most considerable in our language. Exactly. So he levelizes him at a certain level where he is compared with and William Shakespeare and then John Milton. So he says the way people celebrate the poems by William Shakespeare and John Milton are also the same. Keats called him egoistic sublime. Then Lord Alfred Tennyson called him he has uttered nothing base. Browning on Wordsworth said moral inuch, and Shelley criticized words simple and dull. Now Thomas Hardy on Wordsworth says William Wordsworth has a deep influence of Thomas Hardy. According to Hardy, the Leech Gatherer by Wordsworth was his best cure for despair. And what William Hazlitt has to say, Wordsworth was not a truly great poet and the spoiled child of disappointment. So many comments are there on his work. Some are in a positive way, some are in a negative way, but those comments remain very significant. Moving further to look at his work and their major themes, which is quite important, again keeping the exam point of view in mind. Lyrical ballads, it contains total 23 poems and 19 by Wordsworth and 4 by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. With a few other poems, this is a collection of poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge published in 1709. Most of the poems are lyrical ballads were written by Wordsworth, while Coleridge contributed only 5, including Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The second edition appeared in 18 not double, along with preface to lyrical ballads in two volumes. Another edition was published in 1802. Wordsworth added an appendix to title Poetic Diction, in which he expanded the ideas set forth in the preface in addition to 1802. Now, the French Revolution had a greater influence on lyrical ballads. So, the poem The Convict by Wordsworth was there in 1798 edition but was omitted in 1808 edition and added Love by Samuel Coleridge. The preface, Wordsworth claims now in his preface that the rigid aesthetics of neoclassical poetry are arbitrary and distort the freedom and naturalness of poetic expression. And this is kind of a strong claim or a criticism we find him making over here when it comes to define the ideology of neoclassicism, which is quite completely opposite to what romanticism or the romantic poets have propagated so far. And so in 7th edition has a short advertisement as an introduction to, ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower class of society is adapted for the purpose of poetic pleasure. So in his lyrical ballads he said, poetry is the breadth and a finer spirit of all knowledge. To claim how poetry is above all and considered as the highest medium of expression, highest medium of expressions, then are all sort of arts. So the preface is called Manifesto of Romanticism. His ideas, his opinions, his critical thoughts, about the contemporary poetry, contemporary literature, and his reference to the inheritance of neoclassical ideologies. Right. So this is something quite noteworthy to be taken into consideration over here. When it comes to, I'm sorry, when it comes to labelize the work of this great poet. Now, words contributed by Coleridge in lyrical ballads, the rhyme of ancient wonder, it remained in all four editions of lyrical ballads, that is 1798, 1800, 1802, and 1805. Then, Foster Mother Tale. It is a dramatic fragment on Coleridge's 1797 play, Osorio, which is called Foster Mother Tale. Then, The Nightingale. It is included in 1798 edition, The Donjon and Love. It was added in 1800 edition, and The Convict by Wordsworth was omitted. Michael Ruth and the Brothers are the poems that appeared in 1800 edition of Lyrical Ballads, which were by S.T. Coleridge for sure. And in this work, we find Wordsworth gave his famous definition of poetry. Poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion, recollected in tranquility. So Wordsworth stated the purpose in publishing the lyrical ballads in the preface as exactly to choose incidents from common life and to relate or describe them to through throughout as far as possible in a selection of a language really used by men. So what you wanted to state here by saying this is that when you are portraying a common man, your common man should definitely sound like a common man because you are portraying a common man. So when you are portraying a common man, your language of a common man has to be used, because when you are portraying a farmer or when you are portraying a sweeper, or maybe you're talking about a leech gatherer. So when you put words of that leech gatherer then regularly used in the communication into your poetry to describe that character, it gives a kind of 100% success to the portraying of that character and your achievement to appeal your thoughts to the readers. Exactly, when readers find your thoughts quite appealing. So this kind of a statement somewhere is quite important in case of referring to what Wordsworth had tried to say in his second edition of Lyrical Ballads. Now he's a famous quote, keeping the exam point of view, our voice. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Exactly. And rest and be thankful. Come, grow old with me. The best is yet to be. Then bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. What are the other quotations by Wordsworth? Now these are the quotations. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Right? Talking, giving the more of significance to the quality of a nature. Then rest and be thankful, uh, which comments on are going close to the nature. Then again we have it's come, grow old with me. The best is yet to be, where nature is, in a way kind of like trying to talk to the people or the readers. And then bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Right. And so such are the famous quotes that we have from Lyrical Ballads. Now what are the other quotations particularly? They are again very famous. The one is, the child is the father of a man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural pity. My heart leaps up when I behold, is a poem from where these thoughts are taken. The next one is, my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. My hearts leap up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. Right? It is again from my heart sleep up when I behold. Right? Then The poet binds together by passion and knowledge the vast empire on human society. Poets binds together by passion and knowledge the vast empire of human society. Exactly, the vast empire of human society is bound together by the poet through his knowledge and passion. The flower that smells the sweetest is shy and lovely, lowly. All things that love the sun are out of doors. When he has to appeal in a great way, exactly asking people to come out and be close to the nature, we find him making this kind of a statement. And poetry is the breath and the final spirit of all knowledge. It is the impassioned expression which is the countenance of all science, countenance means a face of all science. So it is the impassioned impression, right? Now, preface to lyrical ballads, talking about is a major work. It is an essay composed by Wordsworth, published in second edition in January 1801, often called 1800 edition of lyrical ballads, where he added his views. Now, the essay opening lines are: the first volume of these poems has already been submitted to general perusal. It was published as an experiment which I hoped might be of some use to ascertain how far, by fitting to metrical arrangement a selection of the real language of a man in a state of vivid sensation, that short of pleasure and that quantity of pleasure may be imparted which a poet may rationally endeavor to impart. And so this preface was written to explain the theory of poetry guiding Wordsworth's composition of the poems. So whatever he has composed, he had to make a comment on them and guide the readers about how they are supposed to be read and explained. He wrote this preface to ballad. He defends the unusual style and subjects of the poems as experiments to see how far popular poetry could be used to convey profounding feelings. He is quite completely against this. So he defines his aesthetic as: I have therefore altogether declined to enter regularly upon this defense. So in the preface, he discusses his ideas of what the poet is, what the poetry is, and most importantly, what the language of poetry is. No, he first implies that a poet is one who arranges language expressing ideas in metrical form. This language he arranges is in a state of vivid sensation. He perceives that he has a sensation, and this vivid sensation allows him to come up with the language exactly, and that in a metrical way, right? And he also tells about what a poet is not. He says that anti poets think that they become honored poets this way, but really only furnish food for poor taste that has no solid bearings, and it's a fickle, and it is fickle. And further he adds that, talking about poetry, he says that poetry is in part a matter of what is customary. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This poetry takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. And according to him, poetic language is the language of common people speaking everyday expressions and expressing everyday sensation of rural people in idealized rural life. So are the various points that he has discussed in his lyrical ballads. Moving further, we have his again an important work that adds ode, imitations of immortality. It is from Recollection of Early Childhood. Is a poem by Wordsworth, completed in 1804, but published in 18 exactly, but in a way published in 1807 in the poems in two volumes. The poem was completed in two parts. The first part of the poem was completed in 1802, and a copy of this was provided to Coleridge, who responded it with his own poem, Rejection and Ode, as well as Resolution and Independence. Now, this poem is in a irregular Pindaric ode, in 11 stanzas that combines aspects of Coleridge's conversation poems, the religious sentiments of the Bible and the works of Saint Augustine, and aspects of the elegiac uh, apocalyptic traditions. Now the last lines goes, thanks to human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears, to me the manyest flower that blows can give, thoughts that do often lie too deep for fear tears. Such are the lines. So if we get these lines, we have to find out from his Pindaric Ode, this poem composing this. The prelude. Now, what is there in the prelude? The prelude or growth of poet's minds, an autobiographical poem, is a conversation poem in a blank verse. It is an extremely personal and revealing work on the details of Wordsworth's lives. He began to work on the prelude in 1798 and continued to work on it throughout his life. On a letter to Dorothy, he referred to it as the poem on the growth of my own mind. Yes, a poem on the growth of his own mind. And initially, he titled it Poem to Coleridge. Now, it contains 14 books. The first version appeared in 1805. Book 1 is about introduction, childhood, and school time. Book 2 is school time continued. Book 3 is residence at Cambridge. Book 4 is summer vacation. Book 5 is books. Book 6 is Cambridge and the Alps mountain. Book 7 residence in London. Book 8 retrospect, love of nature leading to love of man. Book 9 residence in France. Book 10 the residence in France continued. Book 11 France continued. Book 12 imagination and test, how impaired and uh, restored. Book 13 imagination continued. Book 14 conclusion. Now in the prelude, there is a description of Cambridge University. Is a famous quote from the prelude is, bliss was in it that dawned, to be alive but to be young was a very heaven. He coined the famous phrase "spots of time" in Prelude, the book number 12, right? And there are our existences spots of time that with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue whence depressed is a kind of expression. In Prelude, moving further, there is an appearance of a boy of a Venander who is affected by muteness in book 5. Books. There was a boy, you know him well, Eucalyptus, an island of Venander, many a time. At evening, when the earliest star began, blew mimic hootings to the silent owls. Such is the description describing the boy. In the above lines, it is clear that the boy of Menander is suffering from muteness. This boy is actually a dwarf, no, a tiny man otherwise. Now, the first version of Prelude in two books was published in 1799. The second version in 13 books was in 1805, and the third version in 14 books was in 1815. The lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey are, for nature then the cursor pleasure of my boyish days, and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. In the above lines, we find he is speaking about both first and second stage in his relationship with nature. The full title is Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tinton Abbey on Revisiting the Banks of Way during a tour, in July 1798. And so this is all about William Wordsworth and his greatest amount of contribution. People exactly that makes him the greatest of all time. Otherwise, so such are the qualities of him which we find that make him in a way uh, the greatest of all time poet. So is his a contribution. Anayo. So this was all about William Wordsworth and his major work. Keeping the net and set examination, we have to keep all those dates, details, his editions, his prominent works, and his quotations from prominent works in mind, so that we are able to get all those things all together. We don't have enough time over here to talk about one poet for a longer period of time, but at least we are trying to cover their major works, which will allow us to move further with whatever they have discussed or whatever they have said, right? And before we commence with talking about Yesti Coleridge, again, one of the prominent figures, exactly, of our period, right? Uh, yes. Before we come in with that, before we continue with discussing about Samuel Taylor Coleridge, let us take a break for 5 minutes, and we'll continue talking about that. Hello and welcome back to our lecture series. We talked about history of literature. So far, we have talked about William Wordsworth, and now we are going to talk about one of the again prominent figures in English literature from Romantic period is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who remains again a significant and a pioneering player of Romantic period. The movement that created a kind of a ins- you know, great historical or remarkable thing in history of English literature, particularly. Let us go and start talking about now Samuel Taylor Coleridge. By the way, mm, to revise of what we have been discussing so far, we are talking about this history of English literature, which we are focusing on Romantic period. We have talked about Wordsworth just now, and let us go and talk about now very profoundly known as S.T. Coleridge. S.T. Coleridge, again one of the prominent figures with William Wordsworth, was an English poet, literary critic, and a philosopher, uh, who, along with his friend, founded the Romantic movement in English literature. He was among the late poets, again labelized by the French German critic, otherwise, that this term was coined by Francis Jeffrey in 1870. He wrote the poems The Rime of Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, as well as a prose work, Biographia Literaria, again a remarkable critical work. He helped in introducing German idealist philosophy to English speaking culture. He coined the term willing suspension of disbelief, which we can find its segments in Literaria Biographia Literaria. Throughout his adult stage, he had crippling bouts of anxiety and depression. He had a bipolar disorder. He was an opium addict, and he wrote about his loneliness at school in the poem Frost at Midnight. Now, in March 1796, he published a journal, The Watchman, to be printed every 8 days to avoid a weekly newspaper tax. But in May in the same year, it was seized. So he wrote 48 sonnets. His conversation poems. It's a group of 8 poems that are the lime tree bower, frost at midnight, the nightingale, etc. He translated the dramatic trilogy Wallenstein of German poet Friedrich Schiller. He wrote his ballad. His ballad very particularly very famous, "The Love," addressed to Sarah Hutchinson, who is the sister of uh, Mary Hutchinson, wife of William Wordsworth. Now, in 1809, he again published a journal entitled The Friend. He gave a series of lectures in London and Bristol, those on William Shakespeare. And in 1817, he wrote Biographia Literaria. Now, Lord Byron, William Hazlitt, and Wordsworth are are his companion in fanciful scheme to establish a utopian community of free love in bank of Susquehanna River. The term psychosomatic was coined by Coleridge. These are the several attributes which we need to know because we may have a question based on them in our exam. The term psychosomatic was referred first coined by Samuel Coleridge. He introduced Christabel meters, the octosyllabic couplet, and full of skillful and rhythmic variation. He is also referred as a high priest of romanticism, right? And this is again two of the prominent factors to talk about is the term psychosomatic and high priest of romanticism, right? So I think these are the remarkable factors about him, right? To remember for sure when we talk about his contribution in a interesting way. Moving further, he said that a smack of Hamlet is in himself, and he also used the phrase "the high road of life." You know, the motiveless malignity is a phrase used by him for Iago in Othello, right? To define what Coleridge had stated about Iago from Othello is motiveless malignity. Exactly, he's malign. His character is malign, but he has no motive behind of his being malign. So Coleridge wrote a review of Anne Radcliffe's The Mad Monk. The German idealist. It was a philosophical movement emerged in Germany in late 18th century and early 19th century. The most notable thinkers of the movement were Friedrich Schilling and Friedrich Hegel. Uh, uh, Coleridge seemed to be inspired greatly by them. Now, willing suspension of disbelief. This is the term that was coined by Coleridge in 1870. It means suspending one's own critical faculties and believe the unbelievable or sacrifice of realism and logic for the sake of enjoyment. You know, there is watching circuits. Otherwise, the willing suspension of disbelief. You suspend willingly for the disbelief. Exactly, something which is unbelievable or unrealistic. You believe it is a real. You believe as a believable just only for the merriment. Through in, through in this term, he suggested that if a writer could infuse a human interest in a similar truth into a fantastic tale, the reader would suspend judgment concerning the validity of the narrative. Concerning the validity of that narrative. The narrative that has been proposed in the writing by the author is already has written with that imagination. So the cognitive engagement in fiction involves a person's ignorance or lack of knowledge to promote suspension of disbelief. Right? If it is imaginative, fictional, unreal, it is to be taken for the sake of enjoyment otherwise. So the willing suspension of disbelief is kind of example. For in a circus, an audience is not expected to actually believe that a woman is cut in half, right? So the definition of primary and secondary imagination is also again famous by him. So according to Coleridge, imagination has three forms exactly in that he mentions in chapter number 13 of Biographia Literaria. That is primary, secondary, and fancy. Now, what is primary imagination according to him? It is the power of receiving the impressions. Yet, it is the power of receiving the impressions of the external one through senses. it is perceiving the object of a sense both in their part and as a whole. So you know this as a pain and you are able to perceive this is a pain. Exactly. It's a title is a pain. So in a both sense, they are part and as a whole. So the primary imagination is universal and it is possessed by all. We all are able to do this. We are able to see everything that whatever we are able to see, perceive, sense, exactly, is a primary imagination. Now looking at the secondary imagination, this imagination may be possessed by others, but it is a peculiar and a distinctive of the artist. How? Because it requires an effort of the will, volition, and conscious effort. It works upon what is perceived by the primary imagination, right? So secondary imagination is depending on primary imagination. So your perception in primary imaginations are made in a way deliberate, where mind is extremely active, involved, and this engagement of mind in this active engagement of mind in this process makes the secondary imagination quite higher and qualitative than primary imagination. Okay, so it's a raw material is the sensation and impression supplied by the primary imagination. So the secondary imagination is not possible without primary imagination. So this definition of imagination is given by Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria. Exactly. So he wrote that the primary imagination I had, I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. So when the human mind receives impressions involuntarily and unconsciously, then it is primary imagination, while secondary imagination requires consciousness. Secondary imagination requires consciousness. So it is the root of all all poetical activity. We call secondary imagination a magical synthetic power. He adds on secondary imagination that the secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the former, that is primary imagination, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with primary in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree and in the mode of operation. The appealing factor of primary imagination and appealing factor of secondary imagination, according to Coleridge, differs in degree. And so he labelizes it, adding further that it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible. Yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and unify. It is essentially important even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. Further, we find him defining the difference between imagination and fancy from again the 13th chapter from Biographia Literaria. Coleridge has described the difference between imagination and fancy, right? What he says, imagination, fancy are the activities of two different kinds. Fancy is not creative power at all. It only combines what is perceived into beautiful shapes, but like imagination, it does not fuse and unify. It just only combines in an order 1, 2, 3, 4. What is collectively perceived. So the difference between the two is same as the difference between a mechanical mixture and a chemical compound. In a mechanical mixture, a number of ingredients are brought together. They are mixed up, but they doesn't lose their individual property. That's a great kind of explanation that he gives about fancy. So fancy is something like that, right? So what he says, in a mechanical mixture, a number of ingredients are brought together. They are mixed up, but they doesn't lose their individual property. जसं आपण भेळ करतो ना, भेळेमध्ये शेंगदाणे टाकतो, चटणी टाकतो, कैरी टाकतो, लिंबू टाकतो, तिखट मीठ टाकतो. या सगळ्यांची इंडिव्हिज्युअल टेस्ट तशीच दिसते, जरी त्याला आपण भेळ म्हणलं तरी. राईट. टू ॲड फर्दर ही सेज, राईट, they still exist as separate identities. Now, imagination. So, it says imagination is a chemical compound. What it is? It is a chemical compound. The different ingredients are combined to form a new compound. Exactly. The different ingredients no longer exist as a separate identity. Imagination मध्ये अनेक गोष्टी एकत्र आणल्यानंतर त्या सबलाईम होतात. एक्झॅक्टली त्या इन्फ्यूज होतात, त्या एक होतात, युनाइट होतात, त्यांची वेगळी आयडेंटिटी राहत नाही. एक्झॅक्टली. राईट. सो दे lose their respective properties and fuse together to create something new and entirely different. Fancy is not creative. It brings together the images that continue to retain their separate and individual properties. That looks like a collage. Collage is a collage, but there is individual image already available. So, fancy is the absence of imagination. It is just reconfiguring already existing things or ideas. Exactly. So, you just reconfigure them otherwise. Now, Coleridge, no, to add the fancy says, fancy, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no longer than a mode of memory emancipated from order of time and space, while it is blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will which we express by word choice, but with equally with the ordinary memory, the fancy must receive all its materials ready made from the law of association. So, law of association, exactly, arrangement, order, exactly, emancipation of memory are the certain conceptualized formats used to talk about fancy. Now, what is the exemplastic? Exemplastic is a power of poetic imagination in biographia literaria. This is the power of synthetic in nature higher than fancy, effecting a fusion of the rational with magical or supernatural. There is a fusion of rational and what is sound magical. So he derived this from Greek that means to shape. And what Coleridge explains, he says that it referred to the imagination ability to shape into one having to convey a new sense. So he describes an organic form as innate. He says that the organic form is innate. It shapes as it develops itself from within, and fullness of its development I'm sorry, is one that is associated exactly the same with the perfection of its onward form. Moving ahead, let us have a look at his major works, which are quite important. Lyrical ballads, which he wrote in contribution with William Wordsworth, then Statesman's Manual or the Bible, the best guide to political skill and foresight, a lay testament. Then Christabel, again a very famous and long narrative poem. Kubla Khan, a vision. Then Pains of Sleep, then Biographia Literaria, aids to reflection in the formation of manly character, confession of an inquiring spirit, hints towards the formation of more comprehensive theory of life, seven lectures upon Shakespeare and Milton, Frost at Midnight, Asra poems, Osorio, a tragedy in blank verse by him in 1797, but could not be performed due to rejection by Drury Lane Theatre. He revised it and recast the play 16 years later with the new title Remorse. So, what is the old name of Remorse? It is Osorio. France and Ode, conversation poems. Total 8 poems are there. A midnight is from them. A frost at midnight is from there for sure. Dejection, again an ode, and it is originally a verse letter to Sarah Hutchinson, a woman with whom Coleridge was desperately in love. Okay, and according to T.S. Eliot, what are his comments on critics? Comments by critics on him. Perhaps the greatest of English critics, and in a sense that last. Perhaps the greatest and the last one. राईट. तसं पाहिलं तर सगळ्यात उत्तम आणि सगळ्यात शेवटचाच. उत्तम असणारा सगळ्यात शेवटचा क्रिटिक असं त्याचं वर्णन कोण करतंय? टी.एस. इलियट करते. चार्ल्स लॅम्ब काय म्हणते त्याला? अ डॅमेज्ड आर्केंजल. एक्झॅक्टली. अ डॅमेज्ड आर्केंजल इज अ लेबल गिवन टू एस.टी. कोलरिज बाय whom? It is by Charles Lamb. Now looking at his work, The Rime of Ancient Mariner. The Rime of Ancient Mariner is a longest major poem by Coleridge, written in 1797 and 1998, where he published in 1798 the first edition of Lyrical Ballads. It was added in Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballad again, as I stated, हे वर्ड्सवर्थ आणि कोलरिज दोघांनी मिळून एकत्र केलेलं काम आहे. ज्यामध्ये वर्ड्सवर्थचे सगळ्यात जास्त पोएम्स आहेत आणि कोलरिजच्या 4 ते 5 पोएम्स ऍड केलेले आहेत. ओके, it is written in 7 parts. It has total 625 lines. The Rime of Ancient Mariner. What is the plot of this? An old ancient mariner, he is unnaturally old with skinny, deeply tanned limbs and glittering eyes, stops at a wedding guest who is on his way to a wedding reception with two companions and starts narrating his story. They try to resist the mariner, but mariner compels them to listen to his wonderful tale. Mariner starts his tale as a narrator. One day, when he was young, he set sails with 200 other sailors from his native land. The day was sunny, and all were in a cheer mood until the ship reached equator. Suddenly, a terrible storm hit and drove the ship southwards into a rime, you know, a strange icy patch of ocean. The towering, echoing rime was bewildering until an albatross appeared out of the mist. Albatross flew alongside the ship and helped the sailor to sail towards a safe place. However, the ancient mariner shot and killed the albatross. Suddenly, the wind ceased and the ship was stagnant on the ocean. The other sailors alternately blamed the mariner for making the wind die and praised him for making the strange mist disappear. The things start getting worse. The sun became hot and there was no drinkable water in the mid of ocean. Water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink is such an expression that we find. Water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. The sailors went dumb from their thirst and sunburned lips. They hung the albatross around the marine's neck as a symbol of his sin. After a painful while, a ship appeared on the horizon, and the mariner bites his arm and sucked the blood so that he could cry out of the other sailors. The ship was strange. It sailed without wind. When the ship neared, the ancient mariner could see that it was a ghost ship manned by death in the form of a man and life in death in the form of a beautiful naked woman. They were gambling for the ancient mariner's soul. Life in death won the mariner's soul, and other sailors were left to die. The sky went black immediately as the ghost ship sped away. Suddenly, all the sailors cursed the ancient mariner with their eyes and dropped dead on the deck. Their souls zoomed out of their bodies, taunting the ancient mariner with a sound like that of his crossbow. The mariner drifted on the ocean in this company, unably to pray. One night he noticed some beautiful water snakes. Watching these creatures brought him unprecedented joy, and he blessed them without, there is without, yes, without. When he was first finally able to pray, the albatross fell from his neck and sank into the sea. He could finally sleep and dreamed of water. When he awoke, it was raining. and an awesome thunderstorm began. He drank his fill, and the ship began to sail in the wind direction. The dead sailors awoke and sailed the ship without speaking. Once Once the ship reached the equator again, the ship shook abruptly and Mariner fell unconscious. In his swoon, he heard two voices discussing his fate, that he would continue to be punished for killing Albatross, who was loved by a spirit, and then they disappeared. When the mariner awoke, the dead sailors were grouped together, all cursing him with their eyes, but suddenly they disappeared. The ancient mariner spotted his native country shore, and he was overjoyed to see a pilot, his boy, and a hermit rowing a small boat out of the ship. He planned to ask the hermit to absolve him of his sin, but mariner's ship was sunk in a vortex in the water. The rescuers pulled the mariner out of the water and thought him to be a dead. They all sailed the boat, but the pilot and pilot's boy lost their mind. The hermit asked the mariner what kind of man he was. Then he told his entire tale to the hermit. The mariner tells the wedding guests that he wanders country to country to tell his tale. After he tells the story, he is temporarily relieved of agony. He tells the wedding guests that the best way to become close with God is to respect all of his creatures because he loves them all. He then vanishes. The wedding guest is stunned and returns home instead of going to the wedding. He awakes the next day, sadder and wiser for having heard Marina's tale. So that's how the entire story goes now with this poem from the rhyme of ancient mariner. Water, water everywhere, and all the boats did sing. Water, water everywhere, and no adopt to bring. Day after day, we stuck nor breath nor motion, as idle as painted ship upon a painted ocean. He prayeth best who loves best, all things both great and small, for the dear God who loves us, he made and loved all. So the last line that he says that the God loves all his creatures because he has made them. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wild sea, and never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, and the furrow followed free. We never were the first that ever burst into the silent sea. And such is a wonderful story. Now, in above lines, the poet states that after killing the albatross, the weather became favorable for sailing their ship in the sea. The breeze started blowing and the sails were raised, which helped the ship to sail in a forward motion as they entered the silent sea. The word furrow here describes the motion of the ship and indicates that the ship was sailing by making a trail in the sea. And such is a fantastic story of the mariner. In actually a rhyme of an ancient mariner, we can see the beautiful skills of S.T. Coleridge describing the fantabulous quality of nature, his narrative style, his choice of words, his handling of metrical qualities. All those things are marvelous, and the way he has handled the story, the narrative thing, and the story, the way he has described the character, the mariner and the wedding guest in a way, and they tell a story, and the mariner goes on telling a story and all about all the other sailors who were there. So such is a fantastic kind of way we find with S.T. Coleridge that makes him the finest of all time. Otherwise, right? Moving further, we have got a story of his Kubla Khan again. Exactly a narrative technique. Let's go and read this. What is the Kubla Khan? Vision and dream. Otherwise, again an interesting story that describes the works of him this way. Kubla Khan is a Vision and Dream is a poem by Coleridge written in 1997 but published in 1916. According to preface of Kubla Khan, the poem was composed one night after he experienced an opium-influenced dream after reading a work describing Zandu, the summer palace of Mongol ruler. and Emperor of China, Kublai Khan, that is Perchaz pilgrimage. So he read that, and by reading that, he had developed this story, Kublai Khan. Upon waking, he set for writing, but he was interrupted by a person from Porlock for a business discussion. Thus, he forgot the lines. At the promoting of Lord Byron, it was published in 1860, right, at prompting. Yes, so he wrote his poem under the influence of Perchard's pilgrimage. So, this is again a remarkable name for, because when we have a question in exam with what was the inspiration for Coleridge behind writing Kubla Khan, it was for Charles pilgrimage. It is subtitled Fragment. The poem is originally in two stanzas. The first stanza of the poem describes Khan's pleasure dome built alongside a sacred river fed by powerful fountain. And then the second stanza is a narrator's response to the power and efforts of an Abyssinian made song. It is written in 54 lines. So first stanza for 26 lines, 27 lines, and second of 27 lines. Okay. The poem begins with a fanciful description of Kubla Khan's capital Zandu, placed near the river Alf. In the poem, Kubla Khan hears the voices of dead and refers to the vague war that appears to be unreferenced elsewhere in the poem. Right, and so the narrator turns prophetic, referring to a vision of an unidentified Abyssinian maid who sings of Mount Abora. It starts with In Zando did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where all the scattered river ran through caverns measures to man down to a sunless sea. Moving ahead, here's again one of the major works is Christabel. It is a long narrative poem by Coleridge in two parts. Uh, in the first, written in 1797, and then second in 1800. He planned the three additional parts, but could not complete. Otherwise, so he prepared the first two parts to be uh, post no included in lyrical ballads, but on the suggestion of Wordsworth, it was left otherwise with their mutual discussion. It was published in pamphlet in 1816 otherwise. Again, along with Kubla Khan, we could see this got published. Krista. Let us go to have a plot of this story. The story concerns a central female character, Christabel, who encounter with a stranger, Geraldine, who claims to have been abducted from her home by a band of rough. She goes into a wood to pray by the large oak tree where she hears a strange noise. Now, while looking behind the tree, she finds Geraldine, who says that she has been abducted from her home by men on horseback. So Christabel pities her and takes back Geraldine to her home. The supernatural signs, as a dog barking, a mysterious flame on a dead fire, seemed to be indicate all was not well. So they spend the nights together, but while Geraldine undresses, she shows a terrible but undefined mark. Behold her bosom and half her side, a sight of a dream of not to tell, and she is to sleep by Christabel. Her father, Sir Leoline, becomes enchanted with Geraldine, ordering a grand procession, exactly a procession of announced her rescue. The poem was published in collection of three poems in 1816, Christabel, Kubla Khan, A Vision, and The Pains of a Sleep. Now the poem starts with, It is the middle of night by the castle clock, and the owls have awakened the crowing cock to wit to woo. And this is how it starts otherwise, right? So then we have got his A Frost Night, then Biographia Literaria, right? So let us go and have a look at those conclusions too. It is a poem written by Coleridge in 1798, and as a part of conversation, this poem, okay, is one of the conversation poems that he has published so far. This poem discusses his childhood experience in a negative manner and emphasizes the need of to be raised in a countryside. Exactly. So this expresses a hope that Coleridge's son Hartley would be able to experience a childhood that his father could not and become a true child of nature otherwise. So Frost at Midnight is something quite autobiographical. Now, the Literaria Biographia, again one of the important works. It is also called Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinion. It is an autobiography in a discourse by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, published in two volumes, written in 1817. It has a 23 chapters totally, and so we have seen in 13 chapter you're talking about imagination and fancy. The chapter 14 is the origin of the famous critical concept, willing to suspension of disbelief, and he discarded the mechanical system for the belief that mind is not an active agency in the apprehension of reality. He believed in the self-sufficing, self-sufficient power of absolute genius and talent as between an egg and eggshell. So the book has a numerous essays on philosophy. In particular, it discusses and engages the philosophy, uh, you know, Immanuel Kant, then John Gottlieb Fichte, and Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, the kind of like a German people. Later chapters deals with the nature of poetry and with the question of diction raised by Wordsworth. The important quote from this chapter is, "Now it is clear to me that in the most interesting of the poems, in which the author is more or less dramatic, as the brothers Michael, Ruth, the Mad Mother, and others, the person introduced are by no means taken from a low or rustic life in the new common acceptance of those words." So in this line, he is contradicting the statement of lyrical ballads with these poems otherwise. So this was all about the two prominent figures from Romantic period, William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, and their prominent works, by the way. In our upcoming session, we are going to start with again another important character, that is Charles Lamb. Fine. So this was all about the Romantic period and the contribution of Romantic writers so far, right? Before we, in a way, conclude with our discussion on a Romantic period. So in our today's session, we talked about Romantic period. It's a brief background, also the historical background. Then we talked about William Wordsworth, again one of the prominent figure, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who remains again also an interesting part of our today's discussion. Fine. This was all about history of English literature, where we talked about Romantic period. We have started talking about Romantic period. We have done with two prominent figures from this Romantic period. Tomorrow we are going to continue with Charles Lamb and his further, no, in the process, the further prominent figures for sure. Right. So let's conclude our today's lecture and meet tomorrow with the same enthusiasm. Till then, have a very fantastic day ahead. Thank you very much.